Hello, this is Charles Brewer, President of the Civil War Study Group here at Lake of the Woods, Virginia. Welcome to the recording of our program on February 24, 2025. So good evening. This is Charles Brewer, President of the Civil War Study Group here at Lake of the Woods. Our speaker this evening is Max Hokit from the American Battlefield Trust. He's a native of San Luis Obispo, California. He graduated from California Polytechnic State University. After serving as a legislative aide to a California congressman, he joined the American Battlefield Trust as a state and local relations associate, and immediately began focusing on the impact of commercial development changes and near historical sites in Virginia. In October of 2022, he was one of the key presenters in the Wilderness Crossing Town Hall held at Locust Grove Middle School. Welcome, Matt.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight and taking some of your time to hear some more about these threats that are so unfortunately present in the Fredericksburg to Wilderness area, Orange County, and everything around it, and really all of Virginia at large. Like Charles said, I've been working with the American Battlefield Trust for a few years now. I come from a government affairs, well, a government background, a legislative background. So for the trust, I work on government affairs. I really focus on local and state level government affairs, and increasingly really only do work in Virginia because unfortunately, even though as an organization we've preserved land in 25 states, Virginia is really a hotbed for these sort of development threats that take, as they ought to, take a lot of our attention. And there's a lot of work to be done to head them off, to educate legislators at state and local level about what they can do to avoid it in the future and how to walk back what's in the pipeline already. And of course, Virginia does have about half of all the battlefield land. Half of what American Battlefield Trust has saved over its history is in Virginia. So you can see where there would be some conflict from time to time with the battlefield. So I'm going to start off, and overall, my kind of plan here is to talk. I'm gonna give some background, talk a bit about the current threats, what's being done, what can be done, um, dive into a couple of the most notable threats that are ongoing. There will be some time for Q&A at the end. I'm sure we have a bit of a spread within this group of how closely folks have tracked certain trends here. So I apologize for maybe repeating some things you may already know, but happy to dive into topics I don't go as deeply on later on when we get to the Q&A. So, like I said, I joined the trust, American Battlefield Trust, in 2021, and as it turns out, that was right about a real inflection point in the kind of threats that we were facing as an organization to the land that we have already preserved, to the land that we want to preserve, and to the land that we all care about and utilize. Um, Before, really before COVID, you can kind of use that as the inflection point. Um, the main threats that a lot of battlefield land faced were what you see on screen here: residential developments, which of course can use a huge amount of land. They create quite a lot of traffic, and they demand other infrastructure basically to support the folks that would live there, be that schools, uh, police, fire, sewage, all those things. More general commercial development, maybe your more traditional strip mall kind of development, which of course also drives traffic and has viewshed impacts due to the uh, practical need to be visible from a road. You want people to come into your store. You want them to know it's there. And then solar, and this is something again we can kind of dive further into, but it's been interesting as I've worked with the trust. It was clear when I was sort of coming into the organization that solar energy development was a real concern from the couple of years before I came in. Um, However, I wouldn't say it's no longer a threat, but we're seeing far less of that direct today of wilderness in another meeting. There's quite an expansive development just to the south of the battlefield. But all told, it's not something that's as front of mind because we are facing these new threats really since COVID that have dominated the space and are just much more pressing than these three. Now, we will come back around to these when we talk about Wilderness Crossing in particular, because Wilderness Crossing kind of encompasses all of the above. There's no solar involved yet, but there's definitely residential and commercial, so we'll come back to that. So new threats have emerged, and I think you can really tie these back again to COVID and some of the ways that's changed how we all live our lives, how we do our work. The If we're on a Zoom right now, we're all utilizing a data center somewhere. Statistically, it's pretty likely that's going through Virginia somewhere. Um, and just the move to more remote work, Zoom calls as a default mode of communicating with people. I didn't really put that on the slide here, but I will talk a bit about how that's impacting things. Um, and warehousing. We all have Amazon Prime and are kind of used to being able to receive pretty much any item within a day or two of wanting to, order it online. So to dive a little more into these in particular, uh, data centers are the top line threat. They are really unlike anything else in their scope. Um, so first and foremost, they're backed by huge financial interests. We talk a lot when we're talking to our members, when we're talking to legislators, we're talking to groups in the community about how we're up against really the some of the most well-funded companies on the planet. The data center developments we're facing are backed by Amazon, they're backed by Facebook, Google. It's no joke that they have money to throw around and the kind of funds that what we might think would be or not think, but would be the most expensive acquisition, we would have ever done as an organization is just cost of doing business, let alone cost of lawsuits and rezonings. Those are negligible to them. Um, Data centers are almost exceptionally land and power hungry. They And there's a later slide where we'll dive into this a little more, but the sort of natural business drive, the economies of scale, and the utility of being close to other data centers sort of means that Northern Virginia has been the hub that has created a spiral out around it of data center development, and they are deeply, deeply power hungry. Again, that's something we're going to get into in later slides. And this is a kind of a fine point, but data centers do lack certain drawbacks that other types of development have in the eyes of local government. And this actually was very relevant to the wilderness crossing debate. I'm sure some of you were probably in the hearing with me when the wilderness crossing was passed by the Board of Supervisors for Orange. Um, Data centers don't need police, really. They probably need a little bit more fire coverage, but they don't need schools. They don't actually create all that much traffic in the long run once they're built. They are, kind of got to hand it to them that for the most part, if you're just looking at the balance sheet of a county, a data center takes land that is not producing a whole lot of tax revenue, and it, with some pretty minor inputs from the county's perspective, produces tax revenue consistently. That is absolutely an oversimplification, of course, and there are some real pitfalls there that I'll get into. But it's changed the way that we interact as an organization and groups like us when we're advocating to local government somewhere about why they shouldn't approve a project. It's one thing if it's a residential development and they're weighing, well, maybe this is good for the community, but maybe adding, you know, we need an extra elementary school and that's not cheap. That gives us a foothold. Data centers don't really have that. Warehousing kind of goes side by side with that, or warehouse distribution centers is the full term. You'll probably hear for that a lot. Again, these are backed by huge financial interests. Um, I should say that for both data centers and warehouse distribution centers, it's not always that Amazon, Inc. is the one showing up at the board and trying to get an approval. Um, it's usually a little more removed than that. It's often that it's a development company who will handle the acquisition of the land, handle the rezoning process, handle the construction itself, and therefore take the heat for all those things. They then lease use of the space to one of these major companies. It's still big money moving around. And really, that actually makes things a little more complicated for us because where we might be able to publicly pressure a company that has a real public image like Google or Facebook or Amazon, hardly anyone in the public space knows who QTS is. And if QTS gets some bad press, it doesn't really matter because their only real customer are these, major purchasers that don't think about these kind of things or don't want to. So on warehousing, we still have the reality that there's major companies at play there and the finances are pretty extreme. It does bring truck traffic. Data centers, one thing you can say for them, there's not a lot of traffic. It's not really true of warehousing. You're going to have trucks coming in at all hours, a lot of load headed out in the mornings. I'll dive in a little bit later about one of the threats we're seeing, particularly with warehousing in Northern Virginia. And then, kind of a byproduct of both of these things, but truly a data center byproduct, is electrical infrastructure, and that's the whole system from generation to transmission. Um, and I think it's the less thought about element of all this because it doesn't, we don't all go down to the county board of supervisors for the hearing about the new, power transmission corridor. It doesn't, it's not the same impact in a single instance. But really, when you build a data center complex, you're also inherently going to need quite a lot of electrical infrastructure for that. And the impacts and the footprint of that infrastructure can be both far more difficult to mitigate from a viewshed perspective, but much more far reaching geographically. So, again, something we're going to dive a little further into. So, I want to talk about Prince William Digital Gateway, which, if you've been following this trend, um, you've probably heard a bit about this. So again, apologies if some of this is a bit of a repeat for you. I think the very first meeting that I had when I joined ABT back in early 2021, the first external facing meeting was about the early fight on the Prince William Digital Gateway. Um, so this is I guess it's a proposal. It's moving towards being a real reality, although there's a lawsuit about that. We'll get into that. Um, this project is in Prince William County, on the border of the Manassas National Battlefield Park and within core and study area of the Second Battle of Manassas and first, I believe. Um, It is exceptionally large, and it is far from the first time that Manassas has faced a threat like this. Actually, for anyone that joins the American Battlefield Trust, one of the things that comes with that, there's a book um, called I believe it's called The Second Civil War. I've got a copy of it here somewhere, but it is about sort of the beginnings of the modern battlefield preservation movement. Um, and really, a lot of that tends to center around Manassas. Manassas has faced all kinds of threats. I mean, you can just imagine, well, you don't have to imagine, you all probably been there plenty, but being where it is, close to the greater Washington, D.C. metro area, there's more and more development pressure over the decades, all the time. It is just kind of the ripest target for all this. And so far, for the most part, the fights to preserve it have been successful. They wanted to put 66 through the middle of the park. They did not get to do that. There was supposed to be Disney's America. That's not there. Um, there have been some losses. There's the power lines that run through the park, and that actually sort of comes back to all this. So to be a little more specific here, the Prince William Digital Gateway is 2,100 acres of proposed data centers, um, which was submitted in early 2021. It would be the largest single data center development on the planet. Um, I do have to caveat that that fact is probably hard to. That was true when I put it in our talking points like a year or two ago. Knowing how data center development is flying forward, I'm sure there's someone else has cooked up an even bigger one somewhere in their mind, but there's not a bigger one in reality yet, that's for sure. Um, it would use, and I should caveat that due to the way that data center developers do not really have to share a lot of the details of what they want to do. We don't know exactly what it would need, but the conservative estimate is that for the amount of data center space they'd be developing, it would use as much power as 750,000 homes, which is roughly 5 times the number of households in all of Prince William County. Again, we don't actually have true site plans. This is a weird thing about data center developments. In Wilderness Crossing, actually, there was an NDA about the potential data center elements, so no one really on the outside could know what they were looking at. But from what we understand of the Prince William Digital Gateway, it would consist of about 34 data center buildings across the site, and they would be of different maximum heights. Uh, the ones closest to the battlefield would be a bit shorter, but we're still talking about buildings of 6 to 8 stories in height, some of them directly across the street from national parks land. So, you know, they might not be the tallest possible data center, which some of those can get 11 to 12 stories really. But we've done the view shed work. You're going to see them from the park, and quite a bit of the park. Um, so there's a bit of a trend, as you'll see on some other points here. But after that was passed by the Board of Supervisors in late 2023, very late, and it was a 27-hour hearing, and I was there the whole time. It was just lovely. The American Battlefield Trust and I should actually correct this point slightly, but it was not just a local landowner. Several local landowners, the trust, American Battlefield Trust, and other organizations brought a lawsuit together against Prince William County for some failures in their process, which there were many. There's 10 counts. And I'll just briefly tell you because we're going to get in a little bit to the Wilderness Crossing lawsuit. The Prince William Digital Gateway lawsuit is a little further ahead just in its sort of procedural timeline. We, back on Halloween, actually, of last year, we had what's called a demurrer hearing, which essentially was demurrer is sort of the defendant's request to dismiss the case as insufficient without grounds. Um, we had that hearing back on Halloween. The judge we really thought we were going to get a full trial from that hearing, and it did not go that way. The judge granted the demurrer, um, which is not the end of that case. We have the right to appeal. We've exercised that right, and we will be going forward with that probably sometime this summer. Court proceedings and their schedule is a bit flexible and hard to predict sometimes, but we're hoping that sometime by late summer we'll have our appeal hearing to that demurrer. All that and all this is just trying to have a real day in court. And that's been our message on that. We want our day in court. That's all we're really asking for. So Wilderness Crossing and its lawsuit. I'm sure, I know I've spoken to a number of you in other venues. Charles, you mentioned the town hall we had at the Locust Grove Middle School. I guess that was probably about 2 years ago now. Uh, yeah, kind of like Prince William Digital Gateway. This project has been on our minds, on your minds, for quite some time now. Um, I put a little less facts and figures in this one about the project itself because I think y'all are pretty familiar with it, but we will go into that a bit. So what makes Wilderness Crossing particularly complicated is that it's sort of all of the above as far as what types of development it is. It is, I would argue it's primarily a residential development, or that's the least flexible part of it. They want 5,000 residential units, and that is pretty set in stone. Um, Beyond that, though, and I would argue for battlefield conservation purposes, the thing that we are the most concerned with is there's 800 acres of commercial and industrial. 732 of those acres are in what the developers call the economic opportunity zone. And why that is particularly concerning is because those 732 acres would be zoned for light industrial purposes. And during that one and only, there was one board hearing only on this massive project. And through the planning commission process, there were some proffers about what could happen in the project overall, but particularly in that economic opportunity zone, what would be allowed to be built there. And there were caps, although they were pretty major volume on their own, there were caps for data center and warehouse distribution usage in that zone, which would have been 5 million square feet total, I believe between both use cases in those acres. Well, on the day of the one board hearing, those proffers were removed. And if I'm recalling correctly, I think it wasn't even provided to attendees that the proffers had changed. We found them online sitting in the hearing. I remember sitting next to Don McKeown from the Piedmont Environmental Council, and we were looking it up on our phones live, realizing that the proffers had been completely amended. And then even during the meeting, the proffers were amended further. Some of that comes back to our lawsuit. Um, so it's a mixed development of residential, traditional commercial, industrial with a data center and warehouse distribution potential focus, really. And again, because of a number of procedural flaws, proffer issues, and things like that, we brought a lawsuit along with the Central Virginia Battlefields Trust and the Friends of Wilderness Battlefield and local residents. So a group with a lot of different impacts they'll be facing from that brought this lawsuit. I should mention that Piedmont Environmental Council also brought their own lawsuit related to the non-disclosure agreements around data center development, which actually succeeded. That one resolved fairly quickly. That was actually how we were able to confirm that it was Amazon who was on the other side of those NDAs looking to do data centers in the economic opportunity zones. So our lawsuit, and I've, at previous uh, opportunities, I've not been able to share too much about our lawsuit, just because that's what our attorneys tell me to do. Um, we can be a little more specific now because as of 3 days ago, we filed our legal briefs ahead of yet another demurrer hearing. So the county and the developers have sought a demurrer, um, again, which is essentially a dismissal of the case. That hearing is about a month from now on March 21st. And this last Friday was when we filed our legal brief, um, you know, detailing what why we don't think a demurrer should be granted and why we should receive an actual trial where we could have, true fact finding and just have our day in court. That is the mantra. We want to have our day in court. We want to, air these flaws in the public setting. Um, so there were a number of failures. What I should really do is share with this group our press release that's going to be going out. I think it's out now. I was working on it today about our filings. Once I ensure that it is public, I will share it with this group for circulation. But that dives into the procedural flaws that are the core of the lawsuit. But it comes down to, the board had a single hearing with major public opposition, with staff still not able to answer key questions. They did not receive the additional water withdrawal they wanted to have, which they would need to have to feed the data centers, let alone housing. Um, and the last minute proffer changes being a major issue there. They not only did the board not have full time to reflect on all those, the public certainly did not. There was not a transparency on that. So anyway, we can discuss more on that. And like I said, I can share our press release. Um, I will also mention here that the March 21st Demir hearing will be a really good opportunity for anyone who's interested in that to attend if you have time and interest, to attend that hearing. And you'll hear, um, it's not quite a full trial, but it is a setting where both sides will present a summary of their arguments. The judge can ask questions of both sides to kind of adjudicate, do we go to a full trial? Uh, the judge does not have to reach a decision on the day, but they can rule from the bench. They can make a decision one way or another in the moment. Um, but it's possible that we will all spend half a day in the courtroom in Orange, only to be told, I'm going to consider it, and you all hear from me in a few weeks. Um, we are going to be hosting, and I think y'all are going to be the first ones to hear this tentative date, but we're intending to do a briefing, a live video briefing about what to expect from that demurrer hearing and how you can attend it on the mid-morning of the 14th of March. That's the current plan, and I will certainly share with this group the particulars as we solidify that. That would be with our lawyer, um, Mike Brady, kind of not only letting people know from his much more legally informed viewpoint than mine what our case is about, but also what to expect from that day of how to be that, how to attend, how to make sure you get a seat, all those kind of things. Um, so I wanted to, here we go. Yeah. So this is just in case anyone here is not particularly familiar yet with the Lake or Wilderness Crossing development. This map is straight from the developer's website. I pulled it down an hour ago. But we've been looking at this for a while. These, I guess, gray hashed areas, those are the economic opportunity zone. They total up to 732 acres over those four land bays. Um, those would be what we heard at the board hearing was that certain members of the board, their primary concern is that those do get built. like I was saying before, residential development comes with drawbacks for a county. There's upsides, but there's also a lot of investment in infrastructure and schools and everything else that come with residential. These gray areas are just tax revenue. If they, in the eyes of certain folks. Um, so if this project moves forward, unimpeded by our lawsuit or any other challenge, I would say that the economic opportunity zones, all four of those land bays would likely be built out pretty promptly because I think that's what was going to fund a lot of the rest of this. You can see that over on Route 3, there's more traditional commercial. They have a town center development, which is sort of a um, semi-pedestrianized city, town center with commercial and I think possibly some like apartment kind of things. And then more traditional commercial around there as well. One thing that's not on this map is that the intersection of, and I'm not sure if y'all can see my cursor or not, but the intersection of Route 3 and Route 20 down here in the bottom left would be realigned, and Route 20 would actually connect to this major thoroughfare of the development. And that's a concern for a couple of reasons. First of all, this is battlefield land through here. It would be newly disturbing um, core battlefield land, and ABT owns land around here. CBBT owns land in here. So new disturbances. This land is the land they would need to do the realignment is owned by the developer, so they wouldn't need to make a new acquisition for that. Um, but that's yet another issue on top of many others here. I'm sure you've all heard about the gold mine mercury contamination that's present on the site. That's a huge other matter that kind of goes beyond our expertise, but is certainly a concern that is very relevant both to people who could live on this site eventually and those who rely on water that comes through this watershed. Um, Again, when we go to Q&A, if we want to come back to any of this and I can explain more, I'm happy to, but I won't get us bogged down on this at the moment. Just want to talk a little more broadly again about data centers and what makes them distinctly uh, difficult for us to deal with and what makes them the threat that they are. That it really falls into a couple of major categories, and it mostly comes down to land and power. I probably could have put water on here as well. I'm going to talk about water as well. But land, they really building a single data center building is far less efficient than building a campus of them, particularly because you're usually seeking rezoning, and that process is essentially just as onerous to do one as to do 34, like Principal Digital Gateway. Um, and also, ideally, you're buying relatively cheap ag land in bulk and then rezoning it into the much more valuable industrial use cases. Um, Now, I say relatively cheaply. One of the side effects of data centers is not just that, you know, we've all worked hard to preserve what's preserved, and the person down the road who still owns their farm might turn it into a data center. That's a concern, of course. But also, it's absolutely changed the market dramatically in Northern Virginia, but increasingly anywhere with a county that has shown willingness to rezone ag land to data center zoning types. Those numbers have just skyrocketed, and we're seeing folks selling their land for, in some cases, um, I mean, it fairly easily can go past $500,000 per acre in the right situation, and sometimes it's gone up to $1 million an acre. And that's just a price point that no nonprofit preservation group can compete in that space, not consistently. We might be able to do it here and there for really important parcels, but that's just not the numbers that we can operate on, and neither can any of our other partners. So it makes the money that the state and that the federal government puts into grant funds all the more important. And obviously, we're pulling money from our donors as well. Um, and we pool those things together. But, regardless of how much pooling we do, if we want to buy a 10-acre swath, which is hardly a swath, 10 acres is 10 acres, and that's going to cost $5 million. We can't do that all day. Um, so it goes hand in hand. It's, they target land that had been cheaper, but their interest makes it expensive. And at the end of the day, like I don't think I can blame folks too much who, they've maybe got some family land in Prince William County and the county's changed around them over decades, and someone comes knocking and wants to give you $20 million for the family farm that's not really workable anymore. It's a pretty tempting situation, and um, it takes action beyond what we're capable of doing to address that, and I'll get to that in a moment. Um, so that's the land element. I should have mentioned on there too that it's really a county failure often too, that these counties are in such a rush to say yes because they want the tax revenue that they don't stick to their own zoning plans. In fact, they just burn them right up and start fresh. We see that all the time, and plans that were carefully crafted over decades that had input from community groups, organizations like ours about hey, you really ought to keep this ag A1 because of a historic preservation concern or whatever else, go right out the window when QTS, Amazon, whoever come knocking. Power, as I talked a bit before, is a huge part of this as well. Um, a single data center building uses more power than entire neighborhoods. Like I said, 34 data center buildings at Digital Gateway is going to be a 3/4 of a million homes worth of power. They also need that power 24/7. They need to be cooled 24/7 because data centers essentially run at maximum capacity at all hours. And they need that power to have backup supply because they are really essentially infrastructure, and you know, you can't you can't just turn off the internet. That's not how our society works anymore. If the grid were to go down, if it was just, a normal power outage or a malicious attack of some sort, they need backup supply to keep the modern world running essentially. And that comes in the form of on-site diesel or gas turbine generators, mostly diesel generators, which are not routinely used to power the buildings. However, we're increasingly seeing data center companies float the idea that Virginia allow them to run off of their on-site generation when either Dominion is not able to hook them up to power quickly enough, or power on the grid is just too expensive, and they think it'd be cheaper to run their generators, which is way noisier and has a humongous air quality impact on the surrounding community. Um, and then, like I said, the power needs to be hooked to these sites. So, I mean, well, I should start with the generation. I mean, the amount of power they're going to need, I'm going to show you a slide in a second here about this. The amount of power they'll need, um, already need, and will need in the decades to come is going to demand many, many additional power plants in Virginia or in nearby states where the power's bought in from. But then you got to get that power in. And Dominion and the other power providers across Virginia and really the Mid-Atlantic are aware this is happening, and they are taking major steps in long-term planning for many new major transportation lines and production sites to feed data centers the power they need. Like I said, here's a chart that is only a little pixelated where I copied it from. This is a chart from the recent JLARC study. JLARC is the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission. It's essentially the research wing of Virginia's government. So last legislative session in early 2024, the Virginia General Assembly tasked JLARC with doing a study on the impacts of data centers on the Commonwealth, both positive and negative. They're supposed to be a neutral research body. That this JLARC study came out a couple months ago now. It's a little bit of a blur to me, but right before the most recent session or at the beginning of. And there's a lot of findings, and I could probably have done 45 minutes just on the JLARC study. What I wanted to highlight this chart, which shows power projected power needs. So you can see the study drew data from initially in 2023, projecting out to 2040. They project that if there were no new data centers built between now and 2040, there'd be a need for a 15% increase in power generation with just, all sorts of other factors, population, whatever else. If unconstrained demand, and they designed that as essentially if everything in the approval pipeline for all these counties that have all kinds of applications pending, if all of those were approved and the trend line continued, how much would they need? They would need to increase generation by 183% by 2040 to match that. So you can see that, the 15% growth otherwise, basically 170% of additional power generation would have to happen to meet the demand from data centers. That could be even worse with the way that AI works. That is, again, something I could dive into for too long. And I'm looking at the clock here and I'm probably running a little long. Um, but, yeah, it's the quick answer is AI is pretty power hungry as well and increases the density of power usage with data centers in a way. Um, so this study was commissioned by the legislature for the legislature. The idea was we need to get a grasp on what's happening here and how we can address it. This session that ended on Saturday was really the first session where legislators tried to broach the topic of we have this massive growth. What are we going to do about it? There are downsides. It's really not a particularly partisan issue in either way. There were supporters for reform on this topic from both parties. There are folks from both parties who are not interested in stepping away the industry. A lot of bills were introduced, very few were passed. Really, only two bills on data centers were passed, and they're actually the same bill. It's just the two different chambers. And it's a bill on siting of data centers. It, to be honest, it does not do a ton for us as people concerned with historic sites. It empowers counties to ask for more information from developers. It's something, but it's not everything we could want. And a lot of good legislation was proposed. For one reason or another, it didn't make it this year, but we're hoping there's not just hoping, there is real momentum right now in Richmond to do something about this because it's not a topic they can ignore, and they're hearing about it from folks every day now. So it's again something I could dive further into. But I think I'm already kind of butting up against my time. So whatever time we do have available, I wanted to open up for some Q&A. Yeah, Charles, if you want to jump in there.
So, if you're familiar with your um, Zoom screen, you will know that there's an audio icon and also a video icon that you can activate. So if you want to ask a question, you can uh, click on activate audio uh, and and then ask a question.
Hey Max, Mike Block.
Hey, Mike, how's it going?
I have on my calendar a court hearing in Orange on the 28th. Is that no longer going on?
It's on the 21st. It's
Okay, what's the
possible that
21st that got moved? Okay.
it is. I don't know. It is definitely the 21st.
Okay.
So yeah, if anyone's got 28 from some other
Yeah, that's what I did. Okay, well, I
previous.
guess I missed that one.
No problem. I'm glad
Oh,
we had another complication where someone thought that Friday, when the filing deadline was the hearing, and I felt bad they ended up down there when there was really nothing to see.
All right, thank you.
So, my viewing of the maps, that are aerial maps showing the various parts of the project as well as local things, parts of Lake of the Woods, et cetera, suggests to me that the rerouting of Route 20 intersection will essentially uh, put uh, Grant's headquarters site within view of the roadway.
Yeah, that's how I see it as well. And to dive into that a little bit, so 10, 12 years ago, I'm sure many of you are more familiar with than I am, there was the Wilderness Walmart fight, which is something that we talk about a lot internally. And at that time, there was that kind of spun into the Gateway Study and the GWAP and all these other kind of like long-term plans that were hoping to address development threats in the area. At the time, we had our architectural engineer types um, look at realignment options for the intersection or non-realignment improvements that could be made to, just improve flow and everything. And the finding at the time was essentially that the currently proposed realignment, where it goes up to I guess is that to the west or behind Grant's headquarters there, wasn't really feasible from like a roadway engineering standpoint. And that's a topic that I don't think we really talked about enough. And in the limited time that was available at the board and the planning commission wasn't something that really got addressed because the topography, there's quite a steep drop from where 20 would now come in and down to 3.
Mhm.
So anyway, yeah, that not only impact to some of the sites, but just like the practicality of that actually being how it works, I'm not sure
Sure.
about.
We have a
Uh,
question. We have a
yeah.
question from Tom Newbig that if the Battlefield Trust is successful at the demurrer hearing, what would the next steps and timing be? And also, thanks for your presentation, he says.
Well, Tom, thanks for listening for, I think I went 45 straight. I was kind of worried I'd come up short, but there we go. Um, so if we're successful, I think timing is hard to be sure about. I would expect that it would be months before we actually have a hearing date or a trial date. Um, I would expect that it might easily drag on to the fall. Um, but the main result would be we would get a real trial where witnesses could be called. I don't. This is not even a matter of our strategy. I'm not exposing anything because we haven't really had those conversations in depth yet. But theoretically, if need be, we could have testimony. We could have um, all the kind of things you imagine like a real trial to be, where demure hearing is a much more constrained legal proceeding that is essentially both sides make a written, you know, filing of what they believe to be the case, and the judge can sort of call on them in the room to discuss items further to help them deliberate on do we need to go to trial here or not.
And Greg, will you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I was wondering, I had read somewhere about Spotsy County supervisors being involved. Are they involved? Do they need to be involved because of the transportation going through Spotsy to get to back and forth to I-95?
Yeah, my understanding is that this came up in a discussion a while back. I was in they don't have a formal involvement. They don't have any sort of decision-making power necessarily on it. I think as a matter of professional courtesy, generally when, especially with that Wilderness Crossing is quite literally on the border of the counties, there's often a sort of, some channel for comment and input
And we have a question, are there best practices for data center development since
level for
some of it will be taking place in the future?
yeah, and it's I mean, really, at the end of the day, what I would say to that is, right now, there's no more governmental steps needed for approval on this. If the lawsuit succeeds, some or all elements of it will be thrown back to the board for approval. And I think that's where, especially after all the additional time and attention paid to this, Spotsy board may want to speak up to their colleagues in Orange and say, we've got X, Y, or Z concern.
And we have Tom Newbig once again.
Again, thank you, Max. I guess there is going to be economic development
Certainly.
in Eastern Orange County at some point. And I guess the question is, what is ABT's thoughts in terms of sort of sustainable, best practices in terms of economic development, and also if there are best practices in terms of data centers?
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great point. We try to talk, especially, when I write our talking points and things for some of our folks to speak with legislators or myself.
You can talk.
But we try to focus a lot on the fact that we're not an anti-development organization. We probably use, we're becoming increasingly web material focused, really. When you talk about the data center fight, I mean, we do quite a lot of YouTube content. A lot of our user base are folks who are, I mean, I'm from California. I know a lot of people back home who watch our stuff but aren't actually coming to the sites very routinely at all, right? They just can't. So it's not that we're against data centers, but it's this situation that really counties have kind of allowed to spiral in on itself, where the counties are kind of the ones that need to stop and raise their hands and say, look, like, we want the development, we want the economic activity, but we zone some of these things A1 for a reason. They're agricultural, they're next to these sites that need protecting. So I think first step is that counties should really take a minute and think about why they zoned the things the way they did already. And maybe there's probably some places where they could relax those things a bit, but they don't need to say yes to the first proposal that comes down the pipeline. So I say best practice is first one, take a breath at the county level. Like you can be a little selective on these things. Um, the I mentioned the Wilderness Gateway study, which was a product of the Wilderness Gateway fight about a decade ago. That was something that we worked on with some outside contractors who are landscape architects, as well as county folks at the time, about what would reasonable development look like in this exact spot where Wilderness Crossing would be. What would be something that achieves the goals of economic development and growth for the county without raising major concerns for us and for other folks who are trying to protect the battlefield. And a lot of what that comes down to is, first of all, density of residential use. And we all know that Route 3 is already a highly trafficked road, 5,000 additional homes. It comes out to something like 60,000 car trips a day or something. I have the number somewhere, but it's really exceptional. And that's a major portion of it. 5,000 homes is just kind of a non-starter in this small of an area, in a community that's not that dense to begin with. We also sought additional setbacks, and this is something I spoke about at the board hearing that we did have. The commercial development that is on the roadway ought to be more viewshed sensitive given its proximity to a national park. Data centers in particular, it's kind of I would basically say that the number one thing would be that they just ought not to be this close, where their viewshed impact would be so detrimental, because it's not as easy as saying a data center ought to, okay, well, a 30-foot building wouldn't be seen from Wilderness Battlefield, so make it 30 feet. The economics just kind of don't pan out on that, for the industry, as best we can tell. And I think that's true. I think it's just there's such a premium on land that could be built into data centers that they're paying so much for the land in the end that it just, unless they can put several stacks of racks up to whatever minimum height, it's difficult to make it work.
Hmm.
So we would say that a site like this that is right in the view line of the battlefield, especially at the scope they're talking about, it would just be very difficult to mitigate that view shed impact. Um, we like to point out that particularly with Digital Gateway, um, there are dozens of data center projects going on, built in the pipeline, whatever stage in Prince William County that I told supervisors, like, you've never heard a peep from us about those, right? We're here concerned about a particular one. We try to keep it tailored in what we are going to come talk to them about. We're not going to raise a stink about everything they want to do. So,
We still have a hand raised. Greg, is
oh yeah.
another question?
No,
Oh, okay.
I
And
guess Max is Tom Newbig again. Can I just follow up on the view shed?
Yeah.
I guess in terms of looking at the map, it looks like the data centers or the light industrial zones is closer to the river. And
Yeah.
so I think an argument at the planning commission hearing was that a lot of the industrial development is going to be below where we're driving on Route 3. And so even if they put, an 80-foot high building plus antennas and HVAC on top, that will not have much, if any, impact on the view shed from, uh, let's say, Wilderness Tavern site or Elwood.
Yeah, it's so they did some limited view shed. I would characterize it as limited view shed analysis. Um, their analysis they did was actually essentially from standing at the 320 intersection. So pretty low in the relative landscape and also with, trees and things around you. Um, we have done some analysis of our own. We feel that one of the weird things about data centers and developments like this, we don't have a huge amount of detail on where would the footprint be, what would the height be, the all-in height with, as you mentioned, cooling and everything. Um, we feel it is safe to say there would be a viewshed impact from visited sites of the battlefield. I think it is reasonable to say that it may not be quite what you see at Prince William Digital Gateway, where we know that we're going to have data center buildings directly across the street from national park land. I think Wilderness Crossings impact concerns are there's still a viewshed concern from data centers that could be in there, but it's a cumulative concern about, 5,000 homes, commercial up all along the road, and everything that it would bring along with it over time. Not to mention that it's a project with a span of, was it 40 years of phased build out? So, construction for decades. Um, but I think you raise a fair point that it's not in and of itself, the data center buildings within the economic opportunity zone, I don't think would be the single greatest viewshed impact we've ever seen posed to a battlefield. But it would be notable. You would see it. We believe, and we've done some work on that, that you would see it. And like I was mentioning, data center buildings don't end with the data center. They're gonna have to power them. And there's not sufficient transmission lines through there to feed what they would need at a data center site. And if you look at Manassas, if any of you have been along the western edge of Manassas, and well, I don't know how long those lines have been there, a couple decades. Um, those are some major power lines.
they are.
That's the kind of thing we're talking about to feed 700 acres of data center development in all possibility.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah,
We were passing through that area today on 66, and there's a lot of large buildings going up, and the cooling units on top of the buildings are themselves almost look like a village unto themselves. They're huge.
yeah, the cooling equipment, and often the height restrictions are usually up to the last built structure level, and then it's cooling equipment, and then it's parapet. So
Uh,
you quickly add 20 feet of industrial on top. Um, you mentioned that. So I think the power lines and things that would have to come with data center development and I don't know what routing would likely take place there, but any direction you want to take a power line of that size would be a major viewshed impact as well. So, but yeah, no, I mean, Tom, I think
I
it's
think
it's
I
it's
think one of
nuanced.
the presentations a while back was uh, routing potential um, power lines through the uh, the parking lot for boats and recreational vehicles,
Yeah,
and that might be a concern there. Are there any other questions? Anyone, please? It's sure you're. One of the things that occurs to me, Max, is that quite obviously letter writing might help.
yeah.
Does your organization by any chance have a web page with addresses that as a resource?
Yet another thing I was talking about today with someone. We're hitting a lot of my topics from today. So I'm actually in the process of I guess, rehabilitating an old Facebook group from the Wilderness Walmart days.
Mhm.
What we're planning to do, I've been drafting up some materials for broad, general talking points on this topic for folks to have available, some suggested, topics to write to local electeds or legislators at the state level as you see fit. And we want to host those on that Facebook site or page. Um, we got to go through some logistics to get the name changed and all that kind of stuff. But I'm getting those together, and we would, yeah, have easy access to the various emails for the right folks to talk to. And certainly that's something I'd share with this group as we get it online.
Well, yeah, and I think that would be very useful because when you do the uh, uh, letter writing and emailing, et cetera, to the legislatures, it's very, very convenient to have the latest data uh,
Right.
and the latest talking points because they only focus on what they're dealing with, right now.
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
and when you do get that up and running, let me know what the link would be, and I'll add that to our website.
Happy to. Yeah, and I'd really like to do that. And like I was saying, I'll share with you all when we finalize exactly when we'll be doing the pre-demure hearing uh, video conference on that. I'll share that as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, then I think this has been a very helpful session. Thank you very much, Max. And the recorded version of this will be on our YouTube channel shortly. So, well, not this evening, but within the next day or two. And thank you again, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you all for the opportunity and taking some time out of your evening. Appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye,
That
everyone.
guys.
Before you go, please remember to visit our website often, civilwarstudygroup.org. We make every attempt on a regular basis to provide informative content. Thank you for visiting, and God bless.